The corridors of the palace are quiet, too quiet for a day that will decide the fate of millions. Beyond the tall windows, the city holds its breath. Inside a small broadcast room lined with heavy drapes to muffle echoes, a man stands alone beside a microphone. His hand trembles slightly as he adjusts his notes. His name is King George II, the man who was never meant to be king. On this day, Britain has declared war on Germany. The air outside smells faintly of rain and fear. The wireless operators wait, silent. The red light on the microphone flickers, live in 5 seconds. He closes his eyes. His lips press together, his throat tightens. Every childhood stammer, every moment of doubt, every cruel whisper in the papers returns to him. But outside, an empire waits, millions of hearts beating in the stillness. The second hand strikes 12. The red light glows steady. And then, through the crackle of the radio, a quiet, halting voice begins. In this grave hour, the words are fragile, but the world listens, because the man who could barely speak has found something greater to say. In the quiet corridors of Sandringham House, a young prince sits alone, struggling to pronounce a single word correctly. His governess waits, expression strained, as the boy's tongue stumbles again and again. "BB boy," he whispers, then stops. His face reddens. This is Prince Albert Frederick Arthur George, the second son of King George V, known to his family as Bertie. He is shy, anxious, and sickly. Born left-handed but forced to write with his right. Plagued by knock knees that require painful metal braces as a child. His tutors call him intelligent but hesitant, a boy who wants to please, but fears to fail. From the beginning, Bertie's life is defined not by privilege, but by expectation. In the early 1900s, the British monarchy is still vast, ruling over 1/4 of the Earth's population, but its image is shifting. Industrialization, war, and Republican movements threaten the old symbols of empire. A king must not only rule, he must represent stability itself. But Bertie is not built for the stage. Public appearances bring sweat to his palms and tremors to his voice. At Naval College, his classmates whisper about the prince who cannot speak a full sentence without stammering. He learns to hide behind silence, to listen instead of talk. The Great War changes everything. Britain's young men fall by the hundreds of thousands in Ypres, the Somme, and Passchendaele. Bertie serves aboard HMS Collingwood during the Battle of Jutland in 1916, one of the largest naval battles in history. He performs his duties quietly and competently, but says little. When the armistice is signed in 1918, Britain celebrates, but something deeper has changed. The monarchy, once unassailable, now feels distant. The people demand connection, empathy, a sense that their rulers understand suffering. King George V sees this clearly. He begins to reshape the image of monarchy, more visible, more human. And though his eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, shines as a charismatic figure adored by the public, Bertie remains in the shadows, dutiful, awkward, invisible. By the late 1920s, Britain faces another storm, not of gunfire, but of doubt. The Great Depression sweeps through the empire. Factories close, unemployment soars, and the working class grows restless. The monarchy's relevance again comes into question. Edward travels the world, charming crowds and shaking hands with miners and soldiers. Bertie continues his quiet royal duties, opening hospitals, visiting factories, always careful, always nervous, his speeches riddled with long pauses and hidden agony. It is during this time that his wife, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, notices the toll. She sees beyond the stutter the gentleness, the sincerity, the conscience. Against royal convention, she marries him for love. And together they begin a quiet partnership that would, unknowingly, prepare them for history's greatest test. But history rarely offers warnings before it turns. When King George V dies in January 1936, the crown passes to King Edward VIII. His reign lasts just 326 days. His love for American divorcee Wallis Simpson plunges Britain into constitutional crisis. The nation watches in disbelief as the king chooses love over duty, abdicating the throne in December 1936. Suddenly, The man who never wanted to be king, the man who could barely finish a sentence in public, must lead an empire. The abdication shatters Britain's sense of security. The monarchy's moral authority lies in ruins. And in its place stands George Fees, a hesitant, reluctant figure in the shadow of his brother's glamour. The coronation in May 1937 is solemn, subdued, a ceremony of restoration, not celebration. The press whispers, "Can he speak without faltering?" The people wonder, can this quiet man rule? Behind palace doors, George Fees struggles with more than language. He is plagued by insecurity, chronic stomach ulcers, and an acute awareness that his own voice's greatest weakness is now his only weapon. As Europe grows darker, Hitler rearming Germany, Mussolini in Africa, Japan expanding across Asia, the king feels the tightening grip of destiny. He reads every dispatch, follows every speech from Berlin and Rome. He knows that soon, leadership will not be about ceremony or speechwriting, it will be about belief. And belief demands a voice. The man who once hid from words must now find them, not for himself, but for millions who will depend on them. The weight of empire rests on uncertain shoulders. And somewhere across the Channel, in the fevered heart of Germany, a new kind of ruler, confident, loud, terrifyingly persuasive, is preparing to challenge everything George Fees represents. In Berlin, banners of red and black drape entire city blocks. Adolf Hitler's voice thunders from loudspeakers, confident, rhythmic, terrifyingly sure. His words move millions, shaping minds, bending wills. It is a new kind of war, one fought first through sound. Across the Channel, Britain listens uneasily. The echoes of the last war are still fresh, the crippled veterans, the endless graves, the ghosts that walk London streets. No one wants to fight again. And yet, something unstoppable is unfolding. Germany marches into the Rhineland in 1936, the first open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Then Austria. Then the Sudetenland. The dictators of Europe, sensing hesitation in the West, begin to press harder. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believes peace can still be preserved through diplomacy. "Peace for our time," he declares, waving a piece of paper signed by Hitler. But the promise is hollow. Behind that paper lies the shadow of war. Inside Buckingham Palace, the new king watches the headlines with quiet dread. Unlike his brother, George Fees is not drawn to grand speeches or political theater. His strength lies elsewhere, in duty, in steadiness, in the sense that one must endure. But even endurance demands expression. He knows that the coming war will not be fought only on battlefields. It will reach into homes, into hearts. Every voice will matter, and his most of all. Still, every time he stands before a microphone, the fear grips him. His throat locks. His mind races faster than his tongue. The pauses stretch, painful and public. In the press, there are whispers of pity and ridicule. How, people ask, can a stuttering king rally a nation when the enemy's voice roars across Europe like thunder? It is around this time that George Fees meets Lionel Logg, an unorthodox Australian speech therapist with no formal medical credentials, just an uncanny understanding of people. Their first meeting is awkward. The king, bound by formality, insists on calling him Mr. Logg calls him Bertie. It is a small rebellion against the walls of hierarchy. But Logg sees what few others do, that beneath the hesitation lies courage, and beneath the formality lies a man desperate to serve. Their sessions begin quietly in a room at the palace. Logg teaches him to breathe, to relax, to speak through rhythm rather than fear. He encourages him to curse when he feels blocked, shocking, but effective, and slowly something shifts. By 1939, the king's voice is still imperfect, but it is his. He no longer hides from the microphone. He rehearses endlessly, preparing for what he knows must come. Because across Europe, the storm has broken. March 1939, Germany invades Czechoslovakia. August 1939, Hitler and Stalin sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a cynical alliance of convenience. And then, September 1st, 1939, German troops cross into Poland. Britain cannot stand aside. 2 days later, the Prime Minister addresses the nation. This country is at war with Germany. The world changes in a single sentence. In the hours that follow, the palace becomes a place of grim coordination. Ministers come and go. Telephones ring. Outside, crowds gather in silence, looking up at the palace windows, waiting. They are not waiting for generals or politicians. They are waiting for the king. The same man who once trembled at the sound of his own voice must now speak to an empire that stretches from Canada to India, from Africa to Australia. He must speak to men who will soon go to war, to wives who will wait, to children who will listen in fear. Every syllable will matter. And as the time for his first wartime broadcast draws near, George Versailles knows there will be no second take. No script can hide the truth. The people will hear every pause, every tremor, every moment of struggle, and decide for themselves what kind of leader he truly is. The microphone stands ready in a quiet palace room. The red light flickers. The king closes his eyes and breathes. Somewhere across the sea, the German radios roar with certainty. But here, in this moment, Britain's answer will not come from volume. It will come from courage. In an empire built on hierarchy, few bonds were as unlikely or as vital as that between King George Festi and Lionel Logue, the self-taught speech therapist from Perth, Australia. Logue was not a doctor nor a nobleman. He was a former actor and elocution coach who believed that speech was not a gift of birth, but a muscle of will. He had worked with shell-shocked veterans of the Great War, men whose trauma had stolen their voices. He had seen how fear could trap a man's breath, how shame could silence courage. When he first met the king in 1926, Logue saw not a monarch, but a man fragile, burdened, earnest. He ignored protocol, spoke plainly, and demanded equality in the therapy room. "My house, my rules," he said. And the king, astonishingly, agreed. Their sessions were unconventional. Breathing drills, tongue twisters, music, profanity, anything to break the cycle of fear. Over time, the boundaries between therapist and sovereign faded. What grew instead was trust. In George Versailles' world of duty and reserve, Logue was a rare presence, a man who treated him not as a king, but as a human being. And in that space of trust, the king began to find not just his voice, but his confidence. For George V's, the stammer was not merely physical. It was the audible scar of a lifetime spent under pressure. From childhood, he had lived in the shadow of criticism, a father who demanded perfection, a brother who commanded attention, and a public that expected flawlessness. Psychologists today might call it performance anxiety, but to him, it was terror. Every public engagement felt like a trial. Each syllable, a potential humiliation. To stammer, in the eyes of the world, was weakness. And weakness had no place on a throne. The irony was cruel. His nation would soon depend not on his armies or wealth, but on his ability to speak. Every time he stood before a microphone, he was at war with himself. His throat tightened, his hands trembled, his lungs betrayed him. The fear was physical, and yet it was not his enemy. It was a reminder of what he had to overcome. Logue helped him confront that fear not by erasing it, but by accepting it. He taught him to pause deliberately, to control his breath, to slow the rhythm, to make silence his ally, not his failure. And in that fragile rhythm, Britain would later hear something familiar, not perfection, but honesty. The stammer never vanished. It softened. It became part of him, part of the authenticity that would make his wartime broadcasts so powerful. A man who trembled, but stood firm anyway. To understand what George Vesey achieved, one must understand what he represented. The British monarchy was not merely an institution, it was identity. It embodied stability, continuity, and moral authority in a world collapsing under extremism. By the 1930s, fascism and communism had turned the strong voice into a political weapon. Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin projected authority through their voices, rallying masses, demanding loyalty. In contrast, the British monarchy spoke through restraint. Its power came not from command, but from composure. And yet, in an age of microphones and radio, composure was not enough. For centuries, kings had ruled by image, now they would rule by voice. The BBC, founded in 1922, became the empire's heartbeat. Through radio, the monarch's words reached villages in India, outposts in Africa, frozen camps in Canada. Each Christmas, the king's speech became more than ritual, it was reassurance. When George Versailles took the throne, he inherited not only a crown but a microphone, the symbol of a modern, connected world. He was terrified of it, but he also understood its importance. His stammer, once seen as a flaw, would soon become the very thing that humanized the monarchy in a time of inhuman war. When the bombs began to fall, people did not need a king who sounded invincible, they needed one who sounded real. By 1939, this transformation, human, psychological, cultural, was quietly underway. The king still faltered, still paused, but now he faced the microphone not as a burden, but as a battlefield. Every word would be measured. Every silence would carry meaning. Every tremor would remind his people that courage was not the absence of fear, it was persistence through it. And in this fragile authenticity, Britain rediscovered something ancient yet new, a monarchy that could feel, struggle, and endure alongside its people. The stammer had not vanished, it had evolved into strength, and that strength was about to be tested in the fires of war, where voices, not armies, would first determine the spirit of nations. In the 1930s, a revolution had already begun, not in the trenches, but in the airwaves. The radio had transformed warfare before the first shot was fired. During the Great War, messages had taken hours to travel. Now, they could reach the world in seconds. Speeches became weapons. Words could mobilize armies, break morale, or ignite faith. No one understood this better than Adolf Hitler. His voice, amplified by microphones and stadium loudspeakers, became an instrument of domination. He could hold an entire nation in the rhythm of his words, his tone rising, falling, commanding. In Germany, millions listened. The Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, made propaganda intimate, bringing the Führer into every living room. Britain, too, had its voice, the BBC. But where Germany's broadcast shouted, Britain spoke. It relied not on hysteria but on trust. King George V's stammering voice, broadcast through those same airwaves, could never match the roar of Hitler's cadence. But it didn't have to. When he spoke, his pauses told a story of effort, of human struggle behind every word. The radio carried those tremors across oceans, across colonies, across trenches. In Canada, in India, in Australia, subjects of the crown leaned closer to their receivers, hearing the hesitation and feeling something profoundly rare in the age of propaganda: sincerity. The stammer, once seen as a flaw, became an unintentional strength. It proved authenticity in a world where oratory had become theater. And for millions, that fragile voice felt more trustworthy than any perfect speech. While the airwaves roared with words, another voice was rising in Britain, one that would soon stand beside the king's: Winston Churchill. The two men could not have been more different. Churchill, the seasoned statesman, was loud, theatrical, and unafraid of risk. George VI was cautious, quiet, bound by formality and duty. Yet when the war began, a mutual respect grew between them. Churchill admired the king's composure and moral steadiness. George admired Churchill's fire and defiance. Each embodied what the other lacked. In private meetings during the early months of the war, the king's hesitation met Churchill's flood of words. But there was understanding. Churchill later wrote, "The king's speech was slow and painful, but it carried a force of sincerity which no orator could equal." Their partnership became the axis of British morale. Churchill could rally the public through oratory, but the king could anchor them through example. In moments of despair, Dunkirk, the Blitz, the long nights of uncertainty, George Versailles' quiet presence reminded the nation that courage could be calm. When London burned under German bombs in 1940, Churchill urged the king to leave the city for safety. He refused. "The children cannot leave," he said. "If they stay, we stay." He and Queen Elizabeth visited the bombed-out streets, walking among the rubble, speaking with survivors, shaking soot-stained hands. The people began calling her the Queen Mother of the Blitz. To many, it was the first time in centuries that the monarchy had truly stood beside its people. Their leadership, one fiery, one calm, formed the emotional spine of Britain's wartime endurance. Together they represented two halves of the same defiance, one voice for the ears, one presence for the heart. Across Europe, Nazi Germany wielded propaganda like artillery. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, believed that repetition could replace truth, that emotion could override reason. Every broadcast, every newsreel, every speech served the same purpose: to create inevitability, to convince the world that resistance was futile. In this war of voices, Britain's task was not to outshout, but to outlast. The king's measured tones were the antithesis of Nazi theater. Where Hitler raged, George Visay paused. Where Hitler promised dominance, George offered duty. Where Hitler's voice sought obedience, the king's invited faith. For soldiers crouched in muddy trenches or sailors braving the Atlantic, those broadcasts became lifelines. They were not polished. They were not perfect, but they were real. And that reality, a stuttering human voice against the machinery of tyranny, embodied exactly what Britain was fighting for: individual courage, human dignity, freedom in imperfection. Even Goebbels reportedly mocked the king's speech impediment in German broadcasts, calling it a symbol of weakness. But the irony was lost on him, because it was that very weakness that gave the British people strength. The king's voice became the sound of perseverance, unglamorous, honest, enduring. And when the bombs fell on London night after night, the people would gather around radios, lights dimmed, to hear the faint, deliberate voice that told them they were not alone. Radio had become the world's new battlefield. Propaganda screamed from one side, authenticity answered from the other. And in that invisible war, George Visay, the man who once hid from his own voice, became a weapon of quiet defiance. The stage was set. The storm was coming. And soon, the king would face the ultimate test, the broadcast that would define his reign and perhaps the spirit of an entire nation. Outside, the streets are unnaturally quiet. In the skies above Britain, the air itself feels tense, as though waiting for something to happen. Inside Buckingham Palace, the king stands in the small, windowless broadcast room prepared by the BBC. Heavy curtains line the walls to deaden echo. A desk, a microphone, a glass of water, a single lamp, nothing else. This is the moment he has feared all his life, the moment he can no longer avoid. That morning, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had announced to the nation. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. The words had fallen like iron across Britain. In towns and villages, families gathered around wireless sets. In London, the first air raid sirens were tested. Soldiers packed their gear. Mothers clutched their children. Now, as dusk falls, it is the king's turn to speak, to give shape to the silence that grips his people. George Visay knows what is at stake. He remembers his father's broadcasts, clear, commanding, effortless. He remembers his own failures, the tremors, the choking pauses, the humiliation of public laughter. But there is no time for fear. The words before him are not his own, carefully drafted by ministers, approved by Churchill. Yet the voice must be his, or they will mean nothing. Lionel Logg stands quietly a few feet away, the only man the king trusts in this room. They had rehearsed all morning. Breathing exercises, rhythmic pacing, the pauses marked in pencil. "Take your time," Logg had said softly. "Forget the nation. Speak to one man may." Now the red light above the microphone flickers. The room stills. The operator nods. The broadcast is live. The king begins. In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, the first words tremble, but they hold. A pause. A deep breath. "I send to every household of my peoples, both at home and overseas, this message." The stammer lurks beneath the surface, like a shadow waiting to rise. But he pushes through it word by word, sentence by sentence. His tone is not loud. It does not command. It reassures. for we are called to meet the challenge of a principle which, if it were to prevail, would be fatal to any civilized order in the world. Across Britain, millions listen. In living rooms, in factories, in barracks. In one small house in London, a mother closes her eyes as her children huddle by the radio. In another, a soldier's wife presses her hand to her mouth. In the colonies, across seas and continents, subjects of the empire stand still. They hear every breath, every pause, and with each one, they sense something more powerful than eloquence. They hear courage. As he continues, the rhythm steadies. The pauses are deliberate now, not born of fear, but of gravity. We have tried by all means in our power to avoid this war. We have seen a nation after nation subdued by aggression. But now that the challenge has been forced upon us, we must stand firm. The words echo through radios from Scotland to Singapore. And for the first time, the man once mocked for his halting speech has become the calm at the center of the storm. Lionel Logue, standing silently in the corner, feels a tear rising. He watches the king, the same man who once could not say his own name without stammering, now carrying the weight of millions. For the sake of all that we ourselves hold dear and of the world order and peace, it is unthinkable that we should refuse to meet the challenge. When the final words come, they are almost a whisper. May God bless you all, and may He defend the right, for it is in this cause that we serve. A pause. Silence. Then the faint click as the microphone switches off. For a long moment, no one moves. The air in the room feels heavy like the end of a storm. The king looks down at his shaking hands. Then, quietly, he exhales. He has done it. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but truly. Logue smiles. Your Majesty, he says softly, you were splendid. Outside, Big Ben strikes the hour. The sound rolls across London, solemn, unyielding. People step out of their homes, look up at the sky, and feel something new rising inside them. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. They know that the voice they just heard, uncertain yet steady, will stay with them through every night of the war to come. From the summer of 1940 through the spring of 1941, the Luftwaffe rains fire upon Britain. 57 consecutive nights of bombing. Warehouses along the Thames erupt in flames, cathedrals crumble, entire neighborhoods vanish beneath dust and glass. But the people do not break. They descend nightly into underground stations, mothers, children, workers clutching blankets and gas masks. They sing to pass the hours. They wait for dawn. And in those hours between explosions, the voice of King George VI becomes something sacred. Broadcasts from Buckingham Palace, recorded in that same modest room, carry across the blackout. The tone is the same, measured, human, reassuring. The Queen and I feel most deeply for all whose homes have been destroyed, whose lives have been torn apart, yet I know that by God's grace, we shall not be moved. It is not eloquence that moves them. It is presence. They can hear that he is tired too, that he is struggling too, and that makes him one of them. In daylight, the King and Queen drive through the ruins unescorted, unafraid. The streets are lined with debris and the acrid smell of smoke. Children wave from rubble-strewn doorways, and the people, weary, soot-covered, unshaven, cheer. When Buckingham Palace itself is bombed on September 13, 1940, destroying the palace chapel, the Queen famously says, "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the face." It becomes a defining moment. For the first time, the monarchy is not above the war, it is inside it. They share the danger, the loss, the fear. For George VI's, it is deeply personal. The palace that once represented isolation now binds him to his people. He walks through the wreckage, inspecting the damage, nodding to the workmen, his face pale but calm. The press photographs him beside shattered windows and cratered lawns, the king who will not flee. And in that image, the British people see something they need more than victory: steadfastness. Every night, London listens to the distant thunder of bombs, to the king's deliberate, careful voice over the radio, to the words that now hold the rhythm of endurance. He never promises triumph. He promises strength. "It is not easy to carry on," he says in one address, "but I know our cause is just and our courage unbroken." The voice that once faltered now carries the weight of a nation's will. Churchill's oratory electrifies his "We shall fight on the beaches" rings like a battle cry. But it is George Visay's tone that comforts, a whisper of reassurance that Britain is not alone, not leaderless, not afraid to endure. The two men, so different in manner, become the twin pillars of British morale. Churchill, the roaring lion. George VC, the quiet heart. Even the enemy begins to take notice. In German broadcasts, Goebbels sneers that England hides behind its stuttering king. But his mockery fails. Because that stutter, the tremor, the human flaw, has become the emblem of something Hitler's machine can never replicate: authentic courage. When the king visits bombed districts, he does not give speeches. He listens. He kneels beside rubble, pats a child on the head, murmurs quiet sympathy. He stands in silence among burned-out homes, his uniform neat, but his face drawn with exhaustion. It is leadership not of command, but of example, wordless, dignified, shared. The people begin calling him "our own birdie." The title that once symbolized weakness now represents unity. In the winter of 1940, when German bombers destroy Coventry, killing hundreds, George Vesey visits the smoldering ruins of Coventry Cathedral. The roof is gone, the great stained glass shattered. He stands amid the ashes as snow begins to fall, bareheaded, unmoving. A local priest later recalls, "He said nothing, but in his silence we found more comfort than words could give." That silence becomes part of the war's rhythm, a moment of calm between explosions, a heartbeat between speeches. The king's very presence, once doubted, now anchors the British sense of endurance. The stammer, the quiet pauses, the careful phrasing, all of it becomes the national cadence. Slow, steady, unbroken. By 1941, Britain still stands. The Blitz has failed to crush its spirit. And across the empire, the king's Christmas broadcast becomes a tradition of hope. That year, his message includes a verse from a poem found by the Queen. "And I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, 'Give me a light, that I may tread safely into the unknown.' And he replied, 'Go out into the darkness, and put your hand into the hand of God.'" Those words, spoken in his halting cadence, echo through the blacked-out homes of millions. They become the anthem of endurance, the belief that no matter how dark the night, the light will return. In the fires of the Blitz, the hesitant monarch becomes the soul of his nation. The boy who once hid from words now uses them to hold a people together. And as Britain emerges from the smoke, battered but unbowed, one truth becomes clear: courage does not roar. Sometimes it stammers. Across Europe, cities lie in ruins: Berlin smoldering, Warsaw erased, Paris scarred, but free. And in London, a weary king steps out onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Below him, the crowd is endless, tens of thousands filling the mall, waving flags, crying, singing. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had defined his reign and nearly broken him is over. George Vesey stands beside the Queen, his uniform pressed, his expression solemn but gentle. He lifts his hand in a slow wave. For once, there is no microphone, no speech to give, only silence and the shared breath of a nation reborn. The sound that rises from the crowd is thunderous. Cheers, songs, tears. But amid the noise, the king feels only exhaustion. The war has taken everything, not only from his people, but from him. The strain of leadership has marked him deeply. For 6 years he has carried the burdens of a crumbling empire, a besieged people, and a nation at war. His one she voice has become the steady pulse of Britain, yet every broadcast has cost him. Doctors notice the toll. His lungs, never strong, are failing. He coughs more often, tires easily. The years of relentless duty, smoking, and stress begin to catch up. But he refuses to rest. When he addresses the nation on May 8, 1945, his words are measured, deliberate, the same rhythm that carried Britain through its darkest nights. "Today we give thanks to Almighty God for a great deliverance. We shall have to strive with the same unity and strength that has carried us thus far to win the peace." The war is over, but his work is not. The empire, too, is changing. India edges toward independence. The colonies seek their own voices. The old certainties, the divine right of kings, the unbreakable empire, are fading into history. But because of George Versailles, the monarchy itself endures. His calm human leadership during the war has reshaped how Britain sees its sovereign. No longer distant, no longer intouchable. He is the family man, king, modest, dutiful, and sincere. It is said that the people's trust, once lost after his brother's abdication, was restored in the glow of the fires he refused to escape. The monarchy, reborn in humility, now stands not above the people but with them. In the years that follow, George VC works tirelessly to rebuild morale. He travels through bombed-out cities, visits veterans' hospitals, shakes hands with factory workers, rebuilding what the war destroyed. He attends remembrance services for the fallen, each one a personal weight. To him, leadership is not about celebration, it is about remembrance. He tells his daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, that true service is to stand firm even when no one is watching. And they watch closely. Especially Elizabeth, quiet, composed, absorbing everything her father embodies. Yet behind the stoic image, the king is fading. By 1948, the coughs grow worse. By 1951, his doctors find cancer in his lung. He continues to work against medical advice driven by duty and guilt at the thought of burdening his daughter too soon. He meets with ministers, attends the Festival of Britain, and even sees off Prime Minister Churchill at the airport, smiling through pain. But his body is failing. The war that had demanded his strength has now consumed it. On the night of February 5, 1952, George Fetzev bids goodnight to his family and retires to bed at Sandringham House, his favorite country retreat. He dies peacefully in his sleep at the age of 56. News spreads by morning. Across Britain, flags are lowered, radios fall silent, and church bells toll in mourning. For millions, it feels like the end of an era, the passing of a man who led not through grandeur, but through grace. In death, as in life, his voice remains in the memory of those who survived the war, halting, imperfect, and profoundly human. The man who once feared to speak had carried his people through their darkest silence. And though his words have ended, their echo still fills the heart of Britain, steady, humble, unbroken. From radios and newspapers, a single name echoes through the city. King George Versailles is dead. In shop windows, portraits appear, overnight black ribbons draped across familiar faces. Crowds gather outside Buckingham Palace, heads bowed, many weeping softly. They do not come to mourn a symbol. They come to mourn a man. The man who had stood with them through the bombs, the fear, the hunger. The man whose halting words had steadied their hearts when nothing else could. Across the world, tributes flow. From Australia, from India, from the far reaches of Africa and the Caribbean, the voices of the Commonwealth speak with quiet reverence. He was a good man, one Canadian veteran says in an interview, and that was enough. We trusted him because he was like us. It is perhaps the simplest summary of his reign, not majestic, not revolutionary, but human. At Sandringham, his body lies in the small church where he once prayed alone during the darkest days of the Blitz. The new monarch, his 25-year-old daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, kneels beside him. She is calm, composed, but her eyes betray the weight of what she inherits. She has lost not only a father, but her teacher. The lessons he left her were not of politics or policy, they were lessons of duty. That strength need not shout. That leadership is service, not spectacle. That dignity, once broken, can be rebuilt only through humility. She will carry those lessons into a new age, an age of television, decolonization, and relentless change, but her foundation will always be his quiet example. The monarchy that emerges after George Versailles is not the same institution it once was. The imperial crown becomes a commonwealth. The distance between ruler and subject narrows. When Elizabeth takes her coronation oath in 1953, millions around the world watch not with skepticism, but with affection. They remember the image of her father standing in the ruins of London, coat covered in ash, and they see in her the continuation of that same devotion. She wears the crown but his voice still echoes beneath it. Historians would later call him the reluctant king who saved the monarchy. His reign lasted only 15 years, yet it bridged two worlds, the dying empire of the past and the fragile democracy of the modern age. His courage did not lie in victory or conquest, but in endurance. When history demanded defiance, he answered not with might, but with integrity. Through war, scandal, and fear, he restored the idea that the crown was not a relic of privilege, it was a bond of trust. Even decades later, those who heard his voice during the war would remember it vividly, not for its power, but for its truth. The slight pauses, the careful phrasing, the effort behind every word. One London woman, interviewed in 1960, said it best, "When he spoke, you could hear him trying, and that made us try too." That was his legacy, the shared endurance between a ruler and his people. In the marble halls of Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens have been crowned for nearly 1,000 years, George Vesey's tomb rests in quiet dignity. The inscription is simple: George Vesey, 1895–1952, his faithful heart. No grand motto, no triumphal phrase, just a recognition of the courage it takes to remain faithful to one's duty, one's people, one's own humanity, even when the voice trembles. And so, in the story of the Second World War, among the generals and the statesmen, there stands this quieter figure, a man who conquered no land, commanded no army, but united a nation with something far rarer: humility in the face of fear. His was not the loudest voice of the age, but it was the one that endured. He never sought greatness, yet history placed it in his silence.